You are on the planet of Evolution Hour, our delightful foray into the wonderful world of Nathaniel Jensen's traced and sundry other little fiddly bit details that come up along the way, which we have an extra surprise that I had not anticipated dealing with, but which we will discuss. Um, First, the obvious stuff with Jensen. He's continuing with his thread from last week, where he spends the rest of the chapter and then into the next one, trying to connect the E1B1 uh, E1B1B haplotype, which he accepts is African, but it, quote, could therefore have been connected to ancient Egypt. So he can kind of drag the biblical elements in there. Unfortunately, not quite according to the data he'd cited so far. On page 64, we get the first citation again, where he forgot to put it in his references altogether. Dear old David Livingstone's 1857 memoirs for an authority quote on African landscapes and local color. Hello, Barbara. Hello, Heat Shield. And he gets a couple other little items, quotes from this kind of stuff. He didn't really add much to the storyline, but he's going for very dramatic bits. But I'm not going to be including in my master listing any of the websites that aren't technically in his reference bibliography. But the oddity is that he doesn't list Livingstone, even though he got it from a book, or at least the online version of the book, because there are websites that he lists in his reference bibliography. So I'm kind of puzzled why the oddity, but that's a minor detail compared to the content. So finally, on page 67, then we get some technical papers. One from 2009 from Zhu, which I will be able to put a link up to because it's open access. And then another one from 2015 by Helgeson, not open access, unfortunately, both of which he acknowledged put human ancestry back about 200,000 years, which naturally doesn't fit the scrunch time frame. But he asserts they were, quote, were based on low quality DNA sequence, quote, unquote, and a mutation rate slower than what he avers. Well, the shoe drop will be next week when we go into the papers that he was trying to argue, the newer material that supposedly contradicted this older stuff. But as it turns out, dear old Zach Hannock, or actually dear young Zach Hannock, has just brought to our attention a relevant paper in this area, a brand new paper by FAN 2023, which is open access at cell.com, which is all about the whole genome sequencing reveals a complex African population demographic history and signatures of local adaptation. And guess what numbers are still prevailing in the field? The African sand and Central African rainforest hunter-gatherers diverged from other populations around 200,000 years ago, still the same number, and maintained a large effective population size. And then the Khoisan, which he kind of dibble-dabbles with in Jensen's book, the Khoisan-speaking hunter-gatherer populations lasting until 12,000 years ago, which is, of course, twice as long as the history of the universe, according to his bits. So the data that keeps coming in of all of these genetic haplotypes and the distributions of populations in Sub-Saharan Africa, not by Egypt, by the way, all indicates how intricate the genetic data is to push this material out. But theoretically, every bit of this can simply be accordion down into a tiny little time frame magically. But then again, that means pushing. He has to have a differential rate. A little spoiler alert about the fact that he's got to have a sliding scale so that older genetic material gets kind of scrunched together, and then he can attenuate it out kind of sort of as he gets into the modern world. But as we know, not attenuated enough. Because he's going to get to the point of where he's got people from the Neolithic actually haplotypes appearing supposedly in the Middle Ages, which is just absolute crashback. Yeah, West Upper Sleep schedule, it's been pushed back to around 70,000 for, well, it depends on which groups are coming out of Africa and all this kind of stuff. But at any rate, for the pure African populations that they were dealing with in this new study, it's not fitting the idea that it's all coming from up in Ararat zone and the traditional Bible tale stuff. So we'll get to more of that next week. The part two that I'll touch on just briefly In November of last year, Bruce Lawrence at creation.com tried to wrangle the rather weird sex life of the anglerfish, where males get amalgamated into the female's body. Whoa, okay. With the all due to the fall, blah, blah, blah. Even though there was a new work on this by Swan et al. 2020 that wasn't mentioned. That paper isn't open access yet, but I'm going to be putting a link into a summary description that at least gives you the basic idea of what's going on. And then a month later, Lawrence comes in again with the sex thing, with equally peculiar sex life of octopuses or octopi, depending on you want to look at it, relating to their dropping dead afterward, after sex, which some organisms have a tend to do that with. Arthropods are rather fond of that. Or in one case, an octopus detaching an arm to do the copulation deed, so just and have at it, kids. Anyway, there's a summary description of that at Live Science, which will get you up to speed on it. Anyway, along the way, he riffed off a recent press release by Matt Wood at Biological Sciences, but not the paper that the press release was referring to. Didn't cite that. Wang et al. 2022. Again, not open access yet, but the link to it is in the press release, so those who can work their way around or have subscriptions to the particular journal in question will be able to get onto it. A clue, though, on the nature of their work is available in an earlier paper that is open access. So I'll be putting a link to that from the Journal of Evolutionary Biology, multiple optic blend signaling pathways implicated. Now, anybody then that wants to compare Lawrence's creation.com postings with the actual technical literature can then decide which one is actually telling you more about anything. Oh, I keep on forgetting to deactivate my little sharing here. Thank you very much for all the patrons. You've had a chance to read through every bloody one of them. Okay, let me show you that again, because it would have been an unbelievably small piece of information when I tried to hold that up to the camera. I'm an old man and I forget sometimes that I forget to deactivate the screen sharing. Now, the little surprise, damn it, Jay, it's Jay's fingers, Jay. Felt sorry for the Japanese. Yes, well, it could be Nipponese. After all, the people in Japan don't call Japan Japan; they call it Nippon. Just as the people in Munich don't call it Munich, it's München. So. Do we call it by the name people call it locally, or do we call it by the name that people who transliterated things into other languages and were the various conquerors who wrote all the stupid guidebooks and that the way they want to tell it? Well, there you go. Anyway, the little surprise little nugget for this particular show relates to my hearing a doorbell early in the morning, like 8 or 9, and I'm not up at that hour. I'm a late hour workaholic, and I typically don't go to bed until early in the morning, and then I'm sleeping until 9, 11, or 12, 1. And I get up when my body wakes up, typically, unless I have an appointment or something, and proceed accordingly, and then go through the same routine. So here I am in my jammies. I'm going out to answer the door. I thought it might have been somebody, a friend who occasionally drops by without letting me know and comes at all hours rather than, trying to wait for me to check on my smartphone. But no, 2 nicely dressed people, an older gentleman, maybe 55 or so, and then a younger kid who's holding on to the iPads. And I immediately go, oh, I bet they're religious people. So is it Mormons or is it Jehovah's Witness or some other? Turns out Jehovah's Witness. So opening up the door when they said they wanted to share some wonderful stuff with me, and I pointed out that, and I could see he was holding on to Bibles and all that I'm a non-believer and it's going to be a tough sell, so this is kind of a waste of time and so forth. But they decided to be a little persistent. They were going to plug away with things. And so I quickly was steering around. I wanted to find out then, okay, if you're going to make a big deal out of this, I want to find out how old you think the Earth is, and whether you believe in evolution or not, and so forth and so on. It didn't take long to establish a few things, not only what they think they know, but how little they thought they know. So when I asked the one younger kid how old the universe was, he suddenly goes into and finally, the 2 of them kind of settle on 6,000 years-ish. So that immediately plopped them down in the younger's creationist frame. Oh, yes, Brian Stevens, ever heard? Yes, it's all, and you get into the same arguments over nationalities where people who have a particular governments that have a particular thing about glomming on to territory will call it one thing, whereas the ones who want to hold on to it are calling it by something else. So there's a big fracas about whether the South China Sea is to be called the South China Sea or not. And of course, the Falklands Islands, that's the British name for the thing. The Malvinas, I think, is what the Argentinians, and they still would like to have it back. So nomenclature is highly political, as you may have noticed, and it is not at all a surprise that sort of thing. Oh, yes. Yes, Jehovah's Witnesses popped up there. Anyway, had I been dressed and been more conscious from the morning, I probably would have been especially cruel and have invited them in to have a little chat about my books and my current projects and my understanding of paleontology and so forth and so on. But as it was, this was a relatively quickie one. And the thing that really amused me about it was how persistent they were based on so little evidence. So I established that they thought there was a 6,000-year-old Earth, and I asked the older one about the flood, when he thought that was, and he settled on about 4,500 years ago, which is about around sort of where you can arrive at by the Bible, except, of course, there's actually a huge range of dates that you come up with, depending upon which version of the Bible you use and which dates you start with and how you add up all the stuff and all that. So it's not at all as clear as one would get. Anyway, the older fellow also was trying to show his knowledge of science at me by saying that the scientists think the universe is 27 billion years old, which is only twice wrong. I think he was muddling the idea that if the Big Bang has been going on for 13 billion years, then there would be maybe of 27 billion light years across, and then he confuses that with the age of the universe or something. But somewhere along the line, he screwed up on that. So I'm already starting to tote up in my head all the areas about which they don't seem to know anything. Jackson, when you listen to this one of the things the younger kid decided to put in, the coral reefs prove the flood. No, and for the life of me, I couldn't remember Ariel Roth's name, but he is functionally the guy in Young Earth Creationism who is the font of all the non-wisdom that has filtered down line and is still cited today. And of course, as we pointed out in Volume 1 of Rocks, that Roth just gets a lot claptrap wrong. And we were able to find this out because horrors, we actually were able to look at the original old papers that Roth was riffing off of very, very badly. So I was trying to urge our younger, both of whom being younger than I am, Jehovah's Witness people to like source check and do that kind of thing. I'm not anticipating that was going to really happen, but I decided to pull the plug and close the bloody door when the guy was trying to weasel me onto a moral discussion of the deterioration of society and all that, because of course this is all part of Jehovah's Witness eschatology and all of that. And Seventh-day Adventists have a very similar kind of structure in their little road shows. But anyway, he says, let me quote from Stephen Hawking. And I said, you've read Stephen Hawking? And without skipping a beat, he said, no. And so I answered, then why are you thinking to throw him at me? So at that point, I decided, and so I could go get dressed and proceed with my actual life on there. And so they skedaddled off, presumably to try the next door down. I had this vision later on of what would be neat if the two Jehovah's Witness people were working down one side of the block and some Mormon missionaries would be working up the other side of the block, and that they would suddenly catch sight of each other across the street from the midway. And then you would get this da 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 da. One would take out, the Book of Mormon, and the other would take out their standard Bible, and they would be prepared to rush across the street in a jouster duel. But I'm afraid that's as far as the thematic fantasy there. Mormons in the Tri-Cities community too. Yeah. Well, the Mormons have, you would think that Utah would be their native habitat, but there's large blocks of them in spilling over into southern Idaho and wriggling along elsewhere. And of course, there's Mormon churches all over the place. You know, you find them. All you got to do is look for the thing that doesn't have a church a crucifix on the top and has a little angel Moroni. There's apparently a hilarious pecking order amongst the various Mormon churches, that typically the Mormon temples are relatively nondescript so that they won't compete with the big one in Salt Lake. But there are some, what the hell a word, they've got stakes, the stakes. Some of their little regional stakes are ones that have such a sense of their own self-importance that they are skirting the boundaries and trying to make their temple as big as possible to compete with the big one in Salt Lake. Which, by the way, the Mormon Tabernacle was just under construction, and the like in that I mentioned in Volume 1, the first of the Paralogs novels, and in their little brief stopover in Utah. In the original Jules Verne novel, they actually went to Salt Lake City, so I wasn't interpolating that, but I provided a little bit more interesting background detail in my novel about it, because Auda, who has her little electric wireless telegraph bracelets that need to be recharged every once in a while, and there's no convenient plug-ins available on railroad trains in the 1870s. So she has a little miniature generator that she uses to charge up her stuff. And so they have to rent a little hotel room for like 20 minutes to do all this thing. And it turns out that there was an actual hotel run by an ex-Mormon who was actually one of the best hotels in Salt Lake at the time. And so that figures in a little bit of vignette of during their stopover. So all of you who love the historical angle, yet another reason to get the Paralogs of Fog novels, because you get to go to so many different wonderful places. And I tried to be scrupulously accurate in describing the place at a particular moment in time, and what you would have been seeing, and what the little foibles and upside and downsides of the places were. That certainly wasn't alluded to in Jules Verne's story, who in a lot of these places, I think he had no idea what the details of the place were, except just reading little side commentaries on it secondhand. So anyway, we're on to Baptists and Hapam. So anyway, whether or not our poor little Jehovah's Witnesses are going to mend their ways, which seem highly unlikely, we'll find out in future if we ever see the young. I suspect the old guy's perfectly set in his ways, and the idea that he could wave a quote from Stephen Hawking when he had never read anything of Hawking to know anything at all about what his view was or what the context of the thing was is all too typical in this area. And as said, if I had been a crueler mind and had been not in my jammies at the moment, I think I would have wanted to invite them in and talked about transitional forms and the reptile mammal transition, and show them around on all of the various research and the things that I'm doing, at which point they might decide maybe they need to run. So I spared them that. Anyway, so far I've been finding with Jensen's book that it's astonishingly thin in terms of the content. It's whereas there was a pretense of aiming at a scientific audience for replacing Darwin, but this is just for the general population, simplistic, explaining in very lengthy detail, but not necessarily documenting the various assertions being made. Now, theoretically, he's going to have to be deploying the rest of the bibliography at some stage. But if it's running in this mode of relatively thin documentation, it's going to be intriguing to see where all of this stuff is coming in. And remember, of course, a big chunk of it are generic secondary sources, histories of various people. So he's taking little bits here, little bits there, presumably because it fits either the local color narrative, like David Livingstone describing a field in Africa, or that he can find little snippets to support his notions of migrations of people from presumably the flood scenario. Bearing in mind that even Robert Carter, the creationist geneticist, basically was going, I don't think so. Means that Jensen is really out on a limb on this thing. And although Ken Ham put a big extolling blurb on the book, saying this is groundbreaking, apparently the ground is still frozen over because it has not exactly set the house on fire in the creationist community, and of course is like crickets in relation to anywhere else. Those who are keeping track of some of these other creationist context, and Joel Duff, when you take a look at this, you can let me know. If I haven't even heard of any particular interest in it other than Dan Stern Cardinale and a few others on YouTube's doing some critical analysis of it, but I don't think it's deserved even an opening yawn anywhere in the regular secular literature. But if anybody knows anything about it, I'm assuming it would get a mention in some of the Kirkus reviews and things like that, because they do cover a lot of the stuff. And I'm assuming the various young Earth creationist journals at some point or another, stuff, British ones and others, will have made little brief mentions and things of it. But it's not exactly looking good from that standpoint. But I will keep that separate from just trying to figure out how he's making use of things. So he's now got 2 of his technical papers that I'll give him. He's not technically misrepresenting it, because he openly acknowledges that the 2 papers that I alluded to had out of Africa around 200,000 years ago. So he's going to try to be using this next paper that's coming along to dislodge that. People do like, and such good people. Yeah. Hello, world. Command Cyborg. Yeah. So it's a funky doodle thing to fiddle out with. I just finished off glomming on to the latest papers in PNAS and Science and Nature and that, and getting up to speed on that front. There's several new works that are going to have to be filtered in on human migrations and that, to keep all of that stuff up to date. There's kind of 2 zones in which that human migration issue comes up. One has to do with post-flood migration, which is bumping into the whole issue of, was there a Neolithic? When did the people get to Australia? When did the people get into the Americas? All of that in the normal chronology is taking place long before any time of Moses. And then the other angle has to do with the bigger picture of our origin of our species in Africa and relationship to the cousins like Neanderthal and all that, what migrations and things are going on there, how early did humans reach China, how many Homo erectus people were there ahead of them. Just as we can see that Box Hill, I think, or Boxgrove Hill, something like that, is a site in Britain that has some of these pre-Homo sapien, Homo erectus sidebars living there about 500,000 years ago. And so you get an awful lot of issues about who replaces who and what happens on what. Some of the things that's just worked out in this, some newer papers, one that Zach was also alluding to in a recent video from the current issue of Nature, Ferguson, I think the name is going into mutation rates and how the mutation rate has clearly not sped up in recent times. And any change, as you look back in the phylogenies, over a long haul, there's a somewhat higher mutation rate, but over short terms, it kind of weeds out. And so it depends on how lineage splittings and things that are going on, none of which is going to help the creationist argument. So we got about 23 minutes in on the show. Does anyone have any comments, questions, other than I see we got side conversations going on, which I feel like I'm losing the audience under those circumstances. And if nothing is afoot, then I'll probably call it a thing and then wait for the system to finalize on the video so I can stick all the links and the material in for next week. And we'll find out whether or not I get any Jehovah's Witness second stringers coming by in the time between next time and next Sunday. So looks like them. Oh, okay. Anyway, I think that will do us for the evening on here. still trying to suck all the material. I finally finished off the grand processing of the Acts and Facts journals. In a way, it's a little easier now because they're doing it every 2 months rather than every month, the way they were before. I think they're starting to run out of money. Otherwise, they wouldn't be, or content even. I mean, how often can you repeat the same thing issue after issue without it starting to sound repetitive? So they're starting to put in little things for kids to play and drawings and stuff to do, and kind of padding things out with lots of ads about their various projects and the coming attractions, like the fact that they're working out how ice forms in ice ages. This is an ongoing project that is basically repeating Jake Ebert over and over again. Yes. The only thing that would be one way for their improvement is for them to stop doing it. I don't anticipate any of that happening. Although what's funky is the extent to which creationism is evolving over time. And the big issue that is now turning into quite a kerfuffle, and Joel Duff has been alluding to it on his end, is how much speciation and air quotes rapid mutations in evolution is the creationist willing to allow before their brain turns into boom. And Ken Ham and a few others looking from aside are going, no, whoa. So they're actually lighting into Kurt Wise and quite a few others who have followed the science as best they can in their model. And structurally, the nature of the fossil record and the nature of the number of species there are and the genetic variation in it cannot avoid having super fast speciation going on in order to get from the created kinds during the creation week proliferating into the ones that are on the ark, and then that filters through, and only the remnants on the ark then get turned into the species that we know. There's no way they can get around this thing. Now, Ken Ham and others, being that they're idiots, don't recognize that that's a necessity. But the ones who do have a familiarity with the paleontological record, who actually have some degrees in the subject, can't wriggle around that data field. They can try to massage it to make it not seem as disastrous as they would like, but still they can't avoid the subject. So to what extent some of the newer brand of creationists are going to be splitting off from the old guard in the same way that the current crop of older creationists have transformed and evolved quite a bit in terms of their belief systems. They've readily accepted plate tectonics when 30, 40 years ago, that wasn't a thing. They've had to kind of throw in the towel on some of the radiometric issues and basically appeal to miracles as a way out of the stuff. We'll see how far any of that goes. Now, in terms of the regular scientific community, it's just an observation that the vast majority of scientists working in areas that creationists don't like them to be in don't know diddly squat about creationists. They don't pay any attention to them. They may think that they're kind of extinct or irrelevant, in which in some respect they are, unless they can get political clout. And the fact that functionally Marjorie Taylor Greene would be an example of a creationist, young earth creationist who's serving in Congress. And so the idea that they can't have an effect in that respect is not at all a done deal. But as a group, they've never been able to make a great deal of impact and have to kind of retread the material, and they're getting more and more of them into these kind of narrow enclaves. You have the new branch of creationists who kind of are playing smorgasbordy and reading the various stuff in the various camps and trying to construct a new model. But boy, always. Oh, yes. That's another new. There's quite a few. There we go. A single cell growing into the forward. There's quite a lot of material on that whole bit about multicellularity, and there's some new material. There's a brand new paper in that out, not open access yet, on exploring more into the enormous range of eukaryotic sex structures. We vertebrates are exceedingly boring at having more or less two main sex units, but why that's so and how that came about in various lineages and why there's been such a frequent tendency to have sexual reproduction in organisms. They're just now getting to the point where they can start really paying attention to how those dynamic systems are working and laying out the parameters are. So it's going to be more goalpost moving available for creationists as they come down the line. And people like Joel Duff and others will be studying this kind of from in-house in the religious community, seeing where they're trying to fit all of the stuff in, as to the regular scientific community, religious or not, really are paying no attention to this at all. Then the other funky one would be the slow lingering death of intelligent design, which all of their attempts to do cutting edge material have been floundering. The Douglas Axe's organization, I think, has closed up shop. I mean, he's going to turn it into as superficial a thing as Patriot University if he doesn't watch out. And then, of course, Biocomplexity, their one and only little journal, has just had a trickle of papers that have been coming out, and nothing to set the house on fire. We'll be alluding to that material in the new book as it relates to some sidebar issues. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff to go on with, and one week is after another. By the way, I would recommend, yes, Zach Hancock. He's a good one. He's very, very knowledgeable and impressively concise summarization of very sophisticated technical issues. And then, of course, Joel Duff, he still does the posts at Naturalist Historia online, but he's doing more and more material or companion pieces of that on videos. And subscribe to his channel. I think he's just gotten over 1,000 subs on that. And of course, we have our co-author Jackson Wheat, his channel, which get way more views than mine do. And Dapper Dino and Gutsick Gibbon and Dan Stern Cardinale. And these are all people who are doing a whiz-bang job of bringing their own technical expertise to the creationism issue. And all independently, we're doing what I would call source methods, to where they would be diving into the material that the creationist is relying on to find out what the facts are and to observe that they were misrepresenting the source material. And so the more people that when you watch how they go about doing it, then that gives you hopefully an inspiration to go on and do source analysis on whatever particular thing you're particularly interested in. So anyway, half an hour in, when you weigh the seas of ignorance, you inevitably drown in nonsense. Yeah, the only problem is that if they're in political power, they can take us with them. And that has happened before in history. And I do not want that to happen again, because that's not a good thing. I want my nice progressing into the future, going to the stars and landing on Mars and doing all neat things that science was supposed to have been doing by now, when we got the Radio Shack 21st century instead of the Stanley Kubrick 21st century. But anyway, everybody stay safe. If you're in weather gunk, everything's been yo-yoing up and down here. We had a little bit of sidebar light snow, but then Chinook winds come along, and so I haven't even had to do any shoveling on there. But things just kind of yo-yo. In the east, yuck. And of course, the big flooding in California and all of that. So there's all sorts of places that are beginning to feel more and more of the brunt of the roller coaster weather cycles that we're getting. That's going to run your insurance rate through the roof. Welcome to the 21st century. So stay safe. Don't accept any wooden penguins. We will see you all next week when we find out more about how Nathaniel Jensen has his head up his ass. So au revoir until